Good afternoon and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Negotiate for Agreement. Thank you so much for joining us. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Shanta Bulai, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. I'm delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Negotiate for Agreement. Accomplishing complex work within an organization requires finesse and strong communication skills. Even when everything has been planned correctly and executed to perfection, complex work is unpredictable and problems will crop up. Personal biases built into people's communication styles, perceptions, perspectives, and attitudes often complicate situations. Join us to learn which subtle behaviors we can use to shift the perspectives of individuals we're attempting to communicate with for mutual benefit. In this webinar, we'll learn how negotiations permeate our everyday activities and organizations, examine the 8-step process of negotiating, and understand the impact of communication styles, cognitive biases, and collaborative approaches in negotiations. It's a pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Bob Monson. Bob, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your wisdom on this topic. I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Negotiate for Agreement. I am Bob Monson. I've been teaching this program for a number of years for the university, and we have certainly had great success in communicating various techniques and methodologies to people that hopefully will enable them to be more effective as negotiators. And while that may seem like a skill that is appropriate for people who do negotiations as part of their job duties on a daily basis, we also discovered that when we reflect upon it, many of us do negotiations really on a continuous basis, even though that may not necessarily be part of what you do with regard to contracting or other things within your professional endeavors. We also find that negotiations are very useful or negotiation skills are very useful with regard to many of the things that we might face every day. For example, when you make a phone call and you're talking to an insurance company about a claim, or you have a neighbor that is causing some sort of an issue in the neighborhood that needs to be addressed, many of these issues really require the same skills that a professional negotiator would utilize. And that's why it's often useful for us to start to gain insight into the negotiation skills, because they largely become life skills. So, for example, if you've ever traveled to another country and you find that it is very common to barter in those environments, many of us think, well, I'll just pay full price and that'll be acceptable to everyone. And that would be a very appropriate approach for me to take. In reality, the negotiation skills that people utilize are often seen as a method of entertainment or excitement or connection between parties. And often we can somewhat spoil the fun for other people if we don't utilize our negotiation skills to the best of our ability. So due to the fact that many of us get very little background with regard to negotiations and negotiation skills in our educational process, we often find that having a little bit of connection to these various skills can often be very useful for us in our professional and private lives. And so that's really what the focus of this class is all about, is to enable our ability to become more effective in this domain area. Now, in the class itself, we actually focus on negotiations from two different perspectives. We deal with the abstract learning perspective, certainly understanding the concepts, the approaches, the methodology, and semantics, and so on can be very useful for us. But it's also very necessary for us to conduct experiential learning in many of these arenas, and negotiations is certainly no exception to that. And so when we are conducting the class, we typically will actually have the students conduct multiple negotiations throughout the day. So while discussing various concepts, approaches, etc., we then practice those approaches and give people practical experience in negotiations. and hopefully enable people to build a negotiating toolkit that they can utilize as they move beyond the class and hopefully start to utilize it in their personal and professional endeavors. So as we construct the class, we focus on first laying out many of these basic tools as far as why are negotiations important? Why would this make sense for us to approach negotiations in these various manners? And then we talk about some of the aspects that are going to contribute to your negotiation skills. Those include different methods for discovery of information, different communication approaches, the motivational theories that back up why people typically are going to behave in the way that they will behave during the negotiation or during any given transaction. And then we begin with relatively straightforward negotiations with single issue and single party negotiations. So here you may consider a dispute that you have with another party and you are trying to resolve that particular dispute, or perhaps it's a financial transaction or some sort of a bartering transaction. We work to find solutions that will be acceptable to both parties from a single issue, single party perspective. As our skills increase and we become increasingly familiar with approaches that we can take in negotiation, we move into more complexity, where we start to utilize multiple issues with regard to a single party. So now when I'm dealing with another party, I'm no longer simply discussing a single issue, but rather I may have multiple aspects that need to be negotiated simultaneously. Often we find that this becomes an easier method of negotiation because it enables us to begin to build inter-issued leverage, and it enables us then to communicate effectively to the other party that we are willing to give in on certain areas as long as we're able to achieve other areas. When we expand our skills even further, we move into single issue negotiations where we may perhaps be dealing with more than a single party. So here, perhaps you're dealing with 4 or 5 different parties who will all have an interest in a specific transaction. And we have to resolve not just our own ending point in that particular transaction, but also acceptable ending points for everyone else involved in the transaction. And ultimately, by the close of the class, we deal with the most complex of negotiations. Those include multiple issue negotiations that are going to be undertaken with multiple parties simultaneously. So throughout the day, we continue to build our skills and increase the complexity of the negotiations approached in the hopes that by the time we are complete with the course, we have developed a wide variety of tools and techniques that will serve us in our future negotiations. Typically, when we are negotiating within the class, we will divide up into either pairs or larger groups that are going to be involved in the negotiations, and each group is provided a given scenario that will describe the role that you may have in that negotiation. Within that role, there's a variety of pieces of information that are provided, which will give you background on the negotiation, which will lay out the scenario, the context, and some of the constraints of the negotiation. As you might expect, the other party, as they have a different role, will also have differing information that sets them up for a practical negotiation that hopefully will reflect relatively real-world situations. So the students, when they are undertaking a given negotiation, will choose either role A or B, and they will only read their particular role before they begin that particular negotiation. This ensures that this represents a very realistic negotiation approach where parties have different information and different insights. And a significant component of the negotiation is the ability to discover the information from the other party, to build a relationship, and to get to the point within the negotiation that the parties can work together to come up with a practical solution to the transaction. Once we've completed those negotiations, we typically will then outbrief with the groups and get a number of groups' input with regard to how they approached the negotiation, which concepts they applied, what success they may have seen, maybe some of the challenges that they faced as well. So, all in all, the course is largely designed to provide a very realistic perspective on negotiations and give people practical examples and experience that they can hopefully utilize going forward. So, to put this into context, perhaps I can share a brief story with you with regard to negotiations. And part of the basis for this story, or the reasoning behind this story, is to really illustrate the fact that many people have difficulty in recognizing when transactions are occurring. They often find themselves in a negotiation where they suddenly realize that perhaps they should have been negotiating, or perhaps they have been negotiating for some period of time. And so we want to become a little more sensitized to recognizing when these transactions occur, such that we can start to utilize our negotiation skills relatively easily in the discussion. So, a number of years ago, my wife and I were planning to purchase a new vehicle, and we had deposited a sum of money in our checking account, which was preparing for the purchase later that day of that particular vehicle. And I happened to be driving to work in the morning. I stopped to fill up my car at the gas station, and as I placed my debit card into the pump, it was refused at the pump, and I thought that was a very strange occurrence. I didn't get too worked up about that in particular, filled up my car, paid cash for my transaction, and went to work. I was speaking to my wife some hours later, and she mentioned that when she was returning from her professional capacity in the evening before, she had tried to use her debit card and found that there was some difficulty in the debit card being accepted at the pump. Now, this was kind of a red flag because I could understand the failure of a single pump or a single connection within the actual gas station network. But it was unusual that that problem would exist for a long period of time or would exist over multiple sites. And so I thought it would probably be best for me to call the bank and find out what was going on. So I called the bank and I asked them if they could provide me any insight into why my card wouldn't work. And interestingly, in the midst of this discussion, they started investigating the account and finding out what transactions had been transpiring in the account. And they pointed out to me that the problem really came down to the fact that we had an $11,000 withdrawal in that account the day before. Now, of course, this was somewhat shocking news for me. And as I was talking to the bank, they told me that this withdrawal had been taken out of our account at sometime after midnight the previous evening at 1:15, 1:18, and 1:21 a.m. from New Zealand. And these particular transactions had together amounted to an $11,000 withdrawal. Well, of course, I was a little concerned about this because, not being in New Zealand the evening before, I knew that this was a fraudulent transaction. So I asked the bank if they could flag these transactions as fraudulent to ensure that the money wasn't removed from our account. And I was informed that actually the bank couldn't really do anything for us because these transactions had been guaranteed by the Visa network. Well, I was somewhat stymied by this response because, of course, I didn't quite understand what that meant. And I asked the individual I was speaking with, what does that mean that it was guaranteed by the Visa network? Well, I was informed what that means is the Visa network has guaranteed the transaction, which freezes the funds in your account, which means that the Visa network will actually make the payment due to the guarantee. Therefore, we have to ensure that the funds are not removed from your account prior to the closing of the transaction. I informed the bank again, well, this is obviously a fraudulent transaction and I don't want it to occur, so why don't we cancel that? Well, we can't cancel it because it's guaranteed by the Visa network. Now, admittedly, I don't have a great deal of experience with the machinations of the banking system, and so I was having great difficulty in understanding what was going on here. But this is one of the problems where people will typically get themselves into trouble in a negotiation, is not recognizing that at this point, as a customer, I am actually involved in a negotiation with the bank. And there are several elements of that negotiation that are present that I need to be aware of with regard to approaching this particular negotiation. So, characteristics that I need to recognize are the fact that I have another individual or a group that holds a disparate opinion of the transaction that I am currently undertaking. So, clearly, the bank has a different perspective on this particular transaction than I do, and that would make perfect sense to me. However, I don't want to make a simple mistake at this point and become irate with the bank or perhaps verbally abusive with the bank, which certainly would be very tempting when we're being stymied with a variety of explanations that we don't really understand. And the problem with becoming somewhat irate or angry is, first of all, it's an emotional response that I'm having with regard to the transaction I'm dealing with. And I need to recognize that this is a business dealing and it shouldn't really trigger an emotional response, but that's, of course, much easier said than done. But secondly, I need to recognize that if I become abusive with someone that I am dealing with in the transaction, they may no longer be interested in continuing this communication. They may no longer be interested in reaching an understanding with me. And by virtue of that, I could damage my ability to move this transaction forward and hopefully come to a practical solution to the problem. So I continued to have this discussion with the bank. And at this point, I was talking with various vice presidents of the bank. My wife was talking to a variety of people that were external to the bank. She was trying to understand what the basic rules and regulations are. Because fundamentally, we have a distinct lack of leverage in this transaction. And what I mean by that is we didn't really understand what we were talking about. We didn't have the necessary background to truly understand how we might gain leverage or gain advantage in this particular transaction. So while talking to other people, we were getting advice with regard to how is it a bank is intended to operate, what are the rules that they operate under, et cetera. And eventually we got to the point where my wife was actually talking to the National Banking Commissioner in downtown Washington, D.C. She was informed at that time that actually, if a demand is made by the patron of the bank to have the funds moved out of the account, regardless of any guarantees or limits on the account, those demands must be honored and the funds should be moved. And so it enabled us to recognize that if we were to construct this discussion appropriately, we could make a request that would result in the funds being moved out of the account prior to the account closing, which would result in the fraudulent transactions bouncing. And that's exactly what we ended up doing. So I remember talking to the individual at the bank on my umpteenth phone call of that particular morning. And I said to the individual, I understand from the National Banking Commissioner that you are required to move the funds if I demand them be moved, and I would like that to occur immediately. It was at this point that I heard a response from the bank where they responded to my request with, "Very well, that's been taken care of, and is there anything else we can do for you?" Now, interestingly, there is a very subtle difference between my getting the negotiation to move in the direction that I needed to and my inability to get the negotiation to a practical closure. In this particular case, it had to do with the knowledge that I was able to obtain and the basic presumption that because I had this knowledge, it would be more painful not to cooperate with us than it would be to cooperate with us at that point in the transaction. Now, interestingly, it is obvious that the bank was not attempting any malicious behavior or anything along those lines. The individuals I was dealing with were undoubtedly following their policies and procedures. Nonetheless, by increasing our knowledge and advancing our leverage, we were able to move the transaction in the direction we wanted it to go. And this is very important that we maintain a level of professionalism within our transactions such that we don't exercise the right that both parties in a negotiation typically will have at their disposal. First of all, we would like people to be willing to compromise, but we also have to recognize that they are typically willing to walk away from the transaction. So these characteristics really point out many of the aspects of a negotiation for us. And when we recognize these characteristics, we should immediately switch into a negotiation approach, which would then enable us to manage our transaction more practically. Now, why is this important for us? Well, as leaders in our organizations, we typically are trying to accomplish things for our customers or for the people within our organizations that we serve. And that means understanding their needs and the ability to plan an approach to meet those needs, ultimately executing on that plan, evaluating how it is progressing and communicating that effectively, and also managing the project in a practical sense. Well, all of these things are simple project management approaches that people would typically undertake in organizations. And when I say simple, of course, I don't mean trivial, but rather relatively straightforward tasks that we must undertake. But ultimately, the success or failure of our projects are largely decided upon by the people that we are serving within the organization, the people that we are introducing the change for. And by virtue of that, we will often find that not everyone is going to get their way in a transaction. And so when we are involved in a project or a development, or we are implementing changes within our organization, we need to recognize that often we're going to have to tell people things that they don't want to hear. We're going to have to tell people no. We're going to have to tell people they're not going to get their way with regard to many of the things that we are doing. By virtue of that, negotiation skills can be very useful for us to be able to soften those approaches, enhance our ability to get across the reasoning and the background for some of these decisions, and hopefully maintain relationships within the organization, allowing us our continued success. Now, negotiations go beyond simply our professional aspects, but also are very useful just as a general life skill. For example, we're going to have many different challenges and confrontations that we will deal with typically within any given day, professionally and privately. And ultimately, we will never be able to satisfy all of the stakeholders that we're dealing with. And by virtue of that, we need to be able to maintain good relationships with all of these people, even though we may have to provide them with relatively bad news. And when it comes to our development teams and the people that are providing us support within our organizations, we need to recognize that there are times when we're really going to need our team to come through for us. And by virtue of that, it's often very beneficial for us not to simply order work being done within the organization, but working with people in a collaborative sense, such that they will choose to support us when the going gets tough. So all of these really are reflected in effective negotiations, and these skills can be very practical and transferable for when we approach these challenges within our lives. We want to create an environment through negotiations where people will feel compelled to help us succeed at what we are trying to accomplish. And that means we want to create an environment where people are willing to support us, where people are willing to move in directions that we find necessary to either accomplish our work or achieve a transaction outcome that we are interested in. And that really is the creation of an influence environment. And being able to influence people is very important. Creating influence is really what negotiators do. And so we want to communicate, we want to set the stage really in any given transaction and communicate in such a way that we can get across to the other party, what is it we're interested in? What is it that we need out of this negotiation? And then in a very practical sense, clarify how what we are interested in will also align with what they are interested in. And from there, build a common ground understanding of how we could create a solution to this particular dispute or transaction that would be beneficial for all people that are interested in the particular transaction. However, this is not trivial. We need to really think through how we are going to go about accomplishing all this and communicating this in a way that will be received by the other party in a manner that will typically nudge them in a direction that we need them to move. And of course, that is a very complex challenge for many of us to face. So we talk about a variety of different areas in negotiation class, areas touching on communications theory, motivational theory, understanding how we build leverage in a transaction and how we gain intelligence in a transaction. So much like the example we spoke about earlier with the purchase of a vehicle, we need to understand how we gain information or how we position ourselves relative to the other party in a manner that both parties will recognize the value in coming to a practical conclusion. The use of rhetoric is often very effective as well because it enables us to construct our communications in a way that gets our point across very effectively. And when we find ourselves stymied by communication challenges, often a shift in our rhetoric will enable us to convey our influence in a more practical sense. Now, to be able to do this, first and foremost, as negotiators, we need to recognize that we're dealing with people. And people are typically not necessarily going to act in a rational or logical sense from our perspective. And there's a fundamental reason for that, and that is effectively that logic and rational thought really are in the eye of the beholder. And by virtue of that, what I perceive to be rational may not be what other people perceive to be rational. My logical construct may not match your logical construct. And by virtue of that, people will typically come across as being unpredictable or not understandable to a large degree. Well, we need to expand our skills in the areas of communication, social aspects, our personality, understanding, etc., such that we begin to gather cues from the other parties based upon their communication styles, our perceptions of them, assumptions we may be making, different attitudes we bring to the table, and begin to build a relationship with the other party through understanding that will enable us to have a firm foundation that we can utilize to further our transactions going forward. This can be a very challenging and difficult aspect for us to grasp, and to demonstrate these skills often requires a great deal of effort on our part as well. So to understand some of these different aspects and perspectives, we gain information from a variety of different areas. For example, the construct of the human brain. As it turns out, the human brain actually has very interesting cognitive biases that are built in. And these cognitive biases can get in the way of our ability to negotiate effectively. And so awareness of these areas can be very useful for us in better understanding how we might choose to approach the transaction. Now, in general, the human brain has two main processing approaches that it utilizes. We have an automatic system, or a fast thinking mode, and this is based in the medulla oblongata. That's the oldest part of our brain. It's very much ingrained. It is often referred to as the lizard brain. This particular section of our brain is what will typically trigger our fight or flight response. And this is the main area that causes us to become emotionally impacted when we are dealing with a transaction. Well, that emotional impact can be very problematic for us, obviously. And so we need to understand when we are triggering our fight or flight response. But we also need to recognize that this automatic system, this fast thinking system, operates all the time, and we cannot turn it off. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in fast thinking mode more often than we realize. And that fast thinking mode can be somewhat intuitively based. And that intuition can often steer us in the wrong direction if we are not aware that we are relying on this intuition. So fast thinking mode has several limitations, and we're going to talk about some of those cognitive biases. But we also need to recognize that fast thinking mode accepts all information as truth. And by virtue of that, our fast thinking brain can't sort between fiction and fact. It can't sort between what we would consider to be a practical solution to a problem and perhaps something that we have observed on TV or in a movie or read in a book somewhere. We can't necessarily sort all those things out. All data is given equal weight and utilized in the intuitive result that we might come to. So let me give you an example of this. If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 parts, how long will it take 100 machines to make 100 parts? Most people, when they hear this particular challenge, would quickly respond 100 minutes. But in reality, if we can shift our thinking out of fast thinking mode into what we will talk about in a moment, slow thinking mode, we should recognize relatively quickly, oh, wait a minute, it actually is 5 minutes to make 100 parts. We just didn't quite understand the logical flow, but our fast thinking mode often will step in and it will tell our slow thinking brain, don't worry about it, I got it handled. And we then intuitively will respond very quickly. Here's another example. If a patch of lily pads doubles in size every day on a lake, and it took 48 days to cover the lake, on what day was the lake half covered? Most of us at this point would respond and say, well, obviously on day 24, but in reality, it was half covered yesterday. So this again illustrates our fast thinking mode, and it illustrates some of the challenges we have with this intuitive response. It can limit our ability to get to a response that is thoughtful and practical. Well, our slow thinking mode is the other side of our brain. This is the side where we are much more rational and thoughtful. It's much harder for people to get things through, to get things past us in this particular mode. Unfortunately, it's also very challenging for us to use. It requires much more energy, and it typically requires us to purposely control our fast thinking and approach the problem from a slow thinking manner. Another factor that comes into play here is often in our organizations, we're told that it's valuable to make rapid decisions. It's effective for us to be quick thinking. And we often even move things into our fast thinking mode on purpose. For example, your golf swing or your ability to read or do multiplication tables. All of these fast thinking modes are very useful because they act as a mental shorthand, but there are going to be times when it will be very effective for us to utilize our reflective thinking to be able to come up with new or creative approaches to a given problem. And that'll be very useful in our negotiation approaches. Now, if you know this, of course, you can utilize this to your advantage. You might put time pressure on someone to shift them into fast thinking mode, knowing that they might make less rational decisions in those modes. However, people will typically use both automatic and reflective, and they will utilize whichever system they think is providing them with the best result that they may choose to, or that they may select from with regard to the negotiation or dispute. Fast thinking mode has additional challenges in that it demonstrates cognitive biases, and that impacts our ability to make decisions. One of these biases is the anchoring effect, that typically people will anchor and then adjust their thinking. So, for example, if I was to ask someone who lives in Chicago, what's the population of Milwaukee? They might say, well, Chicago has about 4 million people, therefore Milwaukee's smaller, I'm going to say 1 million. If I ask someone from Green Bay, they might actually say, well, Milwaukee's bigger than Green Bay, and Green Bay has about 300,000, so I'm going to say 500,000. In effect, what happens is that initial anchor will impact your ability to adjust to a different solution. So in that particular case, the people that were anchored low will typically estimate low. The people that were anchored high will typically estimate high. So in reality, the actual answer is about 580K, and both parties would typically estimate incorrectly based on their initial anchor. The second heuristic that we need to be aware of and cognitive challenge is availability. And in availability, information that is more readily available, that is, I've read it more recently, I've seen it more recently, I've seen it more frequently in news stories, or someone just told me about it, typically will carry more weight than information that has less of availability, information that is older, information that I have not thought about for some period of time. A third cognitive bias that we have is representativeness. And in this particular case, we often perceive that the situation that we find ourselves in is very similar to another situation. It's very similar to how something happened in the past or something that we have observed. As an example, we think that a tall person is more likely to play basketball than a short person, when in reality, there's no real correlation between those two. But because we have seen that tall people play basketball, we may draw an assumption there based upon representativeness. A good example of this happened in World War II when people were investigating the bombing that was happening during the Blitzkrieg in London. And here's a simple map of London with some red dots, which don't actually represent the bombs as they were falling, but are intended to convey the kind of research that they were doing at the time. They were concerned about how the Axis nations were dropping their weapons on the city, and they broke the city up into 4 regions. And they said, all the bombing are happening in the upper left and the bottom right quadrants of the city. That might lead us to believe that all of the German spies are living in the other 2 quadrants of the city. And while that may seem very plausible and effective from this particular position, it was later pointed out that if you split the data differently, it's actually quite evenly distributed. And so we can get erroneous conclusions that can mislead us if we're not careful with regard to representativeness bias in our thinking. Now, how could that be useful? Well, we could anchor other people's thought processes. We could provide data, making it more available to people. We could slice the data in different ways. And all of these are effective methods that people use in a typical negotiation. And of course, we need to be aware that this is happening when other people are negotiating with us. So in the class, we discuss negotiations and transactions from the viewpoint of being able to define a process that will enable us to negotiate effectively. And this 8-step process provides for us great insight and hopefully will enable us to build leverage and move towards a practical solution in the transaction we find ourselves in. And it begins with doing your homework, which means we have to estimate what's known as our anchor point, resistance point, and BATNA. Now, at this point, of course, you're probably a little confused about this terminology. So let me show you graphically what we're talking about. Let's presume we have a transaction we are undertaking. We're going to purchase a new car, for example, and we have a buyer and we have a seller. And when we begin the transaction, the buyer might ask the seller, well, how much is this car going to cost me? The seller would create an anchor point, and that anchor point might be $10,000 for this car. The buyer may look at that and say, wow, that's an interesting line in the sand, so to speak, or anchor for me to consider, but I'd like to pay something less than that. And the buyer then might set their own anchor point that I would like to purchase this car at $8,000 and not $10,000. So by creating these anchors, we have essentially defined the maximum and minimum points of cost with regard to this transaction. Now, of course, in any given negotiation, we know the seller would actually come down some distance, and that would be a distance equivalent to where they reach their resistance point. And the resistance point is where it is no longer interesting for the seller to sell the vehicle. So for example, maybe this is where they already have an outstanding offer, or this is the minimum that they can take for this particular car to clear the loan, or whatever the case may happen to be. The buyer, on the other hand, would be willing to come up to some point similarly that is a resistance point for them. That when I come up to this point, I am not willing to pay more than this because I can get a better deal elsewhere with regard to a car of this type. And in a transaction, we're typically looking for an overlap. That would be representative of our negotiable zone. The other factor that each of the parties typically brings to a negotiation is the BATNA, or what we would refer to by the acronym BATNA, which represents the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Typically, the best alternative is what will be exercised when the resistance point is reached. So, for example, the seller, when they reach their resistance point, have a BATNA of not selling the car and selling it to the person that made the other offer. The buyer, likewise, when they reach their resistance point, have a BATNA they may exercise that would suggest that I'm not actually going to buy this car, I'm going to buy this other car that I saw that has a more attractive number or a more attractive price associated with it. So in the diagramming of the dispute, we can start to illustrate for ourselves where the transaction lies and where there may be an opportunity for us to find a solution. Obviously, if there's no overlap, we're not going to come to a satisfactory solution. But if there is, anywhere in that negotiable zone should be a win-win for both parties. But of course, this gets a little more complex because we typically do not deal with a single transaction at a time. Typically, when we are purchasing a car, we're interested in the car. The seller might be interested in the price. Our spouse might be interested in whether they're going to have access to that car, the speed of the car, the fuel mileage, or whatever the case may happen to be. So these multiple continua can be very complex, and we need to try and keep those straight in understanding our transaction. And so in class, we talk about diagramming these transactions and approaching them from a practical standpoint. So we initially do our homework in estimating our own anchor point, resistance point, and BATNA. We can also estimate to a certain degree the other party's anchor point, resistance point, and BATNA. We then would conduct a discovery process where we are building a relationship with the other party. We're also getting to know more about the transaction and hopefully gaining some insight into where their anchor point, resistance point, and BATNA actually are. Once we feel we can make a practical estimate of their position, now we work towards finding a common ground. So as you might imagine, in a given transaction, both parties want the car to change hands. And so the question is, can we convince the other party that we are both actually on the same side? We both want the car to change hands. The issue is, how much is it going to cost? So can we work together to get to a point where both parties will find the cost to be an acceptable number and both parties can consider their position to be a win? If we can accomplish that by finding the common ground, now we can work with the other party to brainstorm for solutions. We can work on the same side of the transaction and hopefully come to a practical conclusion. Mutually, then, we can select an optimal solution that both parties will find satisfactory. And of course, before we leave the table, we choose to sign the contract or not sign the contract. And that, in a nutshell, is the 8-step process that we exercise in class and in most of our negotiations. So to be effective, we really want to start with relationships. We want to build those relationships such that we can have open communications with the other party. And this means making yourself the priority, being prepared, being able to think and adjust on your feet, being able to exercise your slow thinking such that you can avoid some of the cognitive biases that we have built in. And hopefully making the common ground painfully clear to the other party. Because by doing that, we can then hopefully help them understand why we are here and why they are here, and collectively we can come to a solution that both parties will find attractive. When we try to close a deal, we generally want that deal to be organic, meaning the deal happens before the deal happens. We want to have a strong relationship, a good communication. We want to make sure the other party is satisfied by the time we're done. And that means being a good listener. It means connecting with the other party. It also implies that we should never use dishonesty or a lack of integrity. We shouldn't try to trick the other party. We should instead build trust and help to lead them to a conclusion that both of us are going to find attractive in our solution. So if we find ourselves in a situation where it doesn't look like we're going to get a good deal today, we, by all means, should maintain the relationship, and perhaps we can make a deal tomorrow. That's the most important aspect that we're going to focus on. Because fundamentally, it is generally possible to find a positive sum solution to a transaction dispute that we're dealing with. That means it's mutually beneficial for both parties. Both parties come out ahead. And it means also removing ourselves from the age-old belief that negotiations are about making sure the other party loses. That's not what we're after. We're after collaborative bargaining where both parties win. And by understanding the other party and understanding their approaches and methodologies and why they're at the table, we can hopefully come to a conclusion that both of us will find very attractive. There are essentially infinite outcomes in any given transaction environment. And if we can find an outcome that we will both be satisfied with, it generally will result in both parties being more effective in the solutions that they achieve. Now, interestingly, I've been reading a book fairly recently that is known as Think Again by Adam Grant. And I would highly recommend this book as a text that will enable us to better understand negotiations and what it is we're trying to accomplish. In the text, Adam Grant talks on a variety of subjects, but there are some very interesting nuggets that help us understand negotiations to a large degree. He notes that a good debate or dispute is really not like a war. And unfortunately, that's where many of us have been educated with regard to negotiations. It's more like a dance where the other party has a different dance step in mind. And if we can understand where they're coming from, we can better move them in the direction we need them to go. If we try too hard to lead, if we push too hard, their natural inclination is to resist. If, however, we adapt and get the other party to adapt, now we can begin to dance together and hopefully come up with a better solution for both of us. In the studies of negotiators that have been conducted, they found that amateur negotiators really go in armed for battle. They see it as a war. Skilled negotiators, however, think of it more like these dance moves. They focus on that common ground. They focus on helping the other party understand how we will both win in this particular transaction. Amateur negotiators like to create thousands of reasons why you're wrong and I'm right, and that is not typically accepted by the other party effectively. And these defend-attack spirals can be very costly for us. Skilled negotiators, on the other hand, ask very open-ended questions, allow the other party to be a party in the dispute, allow the other party to be heard and to be communicating with us. And that's very important. It really touches in the domain of motivational interviewing. And in motivational interviewing, we're not really focusing on trying to force people to do something. We are trying to help them see new possibilities. We're trying to help them get to the conclusions that we can perhaps see and hopefully share with them the ability to see those same conclusions. That's when people will start to change their opinions and positions. And that's when we can start to get to a practical solution to the transaction at hand. There's three main techniques in motivational interviewing, one being asking open-ended questions. Secondly, being very reflective in our listening. And by virtue of that, what we mean is You actually need to be willing to change your own opinions as well. And ultimately, affirming that the other person is reasonable, rational, and practical in their position, and they have a right to change their mind or hold their opinion. And by virtue of that, we are trying to bring them to a conclusion that will be beneficial for both of us without the use of manipulation. Psychologists have generally found that when people detect an attempt at manipulation or overt influence, they're very sophisticated in their defense mechanisms. If they think they're being forced into a conclusion, they will see anything that we bring forth as a question as a political tactic. They will see any sort of reflective listening as a sophisticated maneuver. They will see affirmation as preaching. And we need to move beyond that and recognize that we truly have to be engaged in helping them succeed, or we are unlikely to get to a conclusion that will be practical for both of us. So in a variety of experiments that have been conducted, it turns out that non-judgmental, attentive listeners make people less anxious and less defensive. When people feel less of this pressure, they're much more able to recognize nuances in the arguments, and they're more willing to share this information. So fundamentally, we're trying to build a trusting relationship and then get into a dialogue with the other party. By listening and being genuinely interested in the other party achieving their goals, we can demonstrate we care about them, and we are much more likely to get to a conclusion that both of us will find attractive in the situation. So as an example, during the transaction, we may ask ourselves questions like these. How can I make sure the other party achieves what they need to achieve? Can I make it better for them? What could I do at minimal cost? All of these are somewhat anathema to us in our basic understanding of negotiations. But when we embrace this concept of collaborative bargaining, we find that we can be far more effective. And so these skills can be very useful for us to practice and hone as we move into our negotiations professionally and privately. And so in the class itself, we talk about a variety of these things, like keeping our head in the game, not bargaining over positions, focusing on the party's interests in the transactions as opposed to really positioning ourselves or trying to force an outcome. Focusing on the people, not pointing fingers, being honest, being open, having integrity, and brainstorming for mutual gain, getting to both parties' conclusions. These can be very important aspects for us. We want to use objective criteria, keeping emotions out of our communications. We want to be able to exercise our BATNA in the event we need to move away from the transaction. And so I have for you, as a last slide here, a brief negotiation out of the movie True Grit. We'll see a young lady here who demonstrates many of these skills. And she, first of all, keeps herself very engaged in the transaction, but also pays very close attention to maneuvering that is being done by the other party and manages the transaction very effectively. She is in a position where her father has been killed. She is seeking to return some horses that he purchased and get his horse back. So let's see how she approaches this, as many of the skills we've just talked about are demonstrated amply in this particular example.
How much are you paying for cotton?
9.5 for low middling and 10 for ordinary.
We got most of ours out early. Sold to the Woodson brothers in Little Rock for 11 cents.
And I suggest you take the balance of it to the Woodson brothers.
You took the balance to Woodson. We got 10 and a half.
Why'd you come here to tell me this?
Oh, I thought we might shop around up here next year, but I guess we're doing all right in Little Rock. I'm Maddie Ross, daughter of Frank Ross.
Oh, tragic thing. Now I say your father impressed me With his manly qualities, he was a close trader, but he acted the gentleman.
Well, I propose to sell those ponies back to you that my father bought.
Oh, that I fear is out of the question. I will see that they're shipped to you at my earliest convenience.
We don't want the ponies now. We don't need them.
Well, that hardly concerns me. Your father bought the ponies and paid for them, and there's an end of it. I have the bill of sale.
And I want $300 for Papa's saddle horse that was stolen from your stable.
You have to take that up with the man who stole the horse.
Tom Chaney stole the horse while it was in your care. You are responsible.
Yeah, I admire your sand. But I believe you will find I'm not liable for such claims.
You were the custodian. If you were a bank ever robbed, you could not simply tell the depositors to go hang.
I do not entertain hypotheticals. The world as it is vexing enough. Secondly, your valuation of the horse is high by about $200. How old are
If
you?
anything, my price is low. Price Judy is a fine racing mare. I've seen her jump an 8-rail fence with the heavy rider. I'm 14.
Oh, well, it's all very interesting. The ponies are yours. Take them. Your father's horse was stolen by a murderous criminal. I had provided reasonable protection for the creature as per our implicit agreement. My watchman had his teeth knocked out and can take only soup.
I will take it to law.
You have no case.
Lawyer J. Noble Daggett of Dardanelle, Arkansas, may think otherwise, is might a jury. Petitioned by a widow and 3 small children.
I will pay $200 to your father's estate when I have in my hand a letter from your lawyer absolving me of all liability from the beginning of the world to
I will
date.
take $200 for Judy, plus $100 for the ponies, and $25 for the gray horse that Tom Chaney left. He was easily worth $40. That is $325
The
total.
ponies have no part in it. I will not buy them.
And the price for Judy is $325.
I would not pay $325 for a winged Pegasus. As for the gray horse, it does not belong to you.
The gray horse was lent to Tom Chaney by my father. Chaney only had the use of him.
I will pay $225 and keep the gray horse. I don't want the ponies.
Not accept that. There will be no settlement after I leave this office. It will go to law.
All right, this is my last offer. $250. For that, I get the release previously discussed, and I keep your father's saddle. The gray horse is not yours to sell.
The saddle is not for sale. I will keep it. Lawyer Daggett will prove ownership of the gray horse. He will come after you with a writ of replevin.
A what?
Writ of
All right,
replevin.
now listen very carefully, as I will not bargain further. I will take the ponies back and the gray horse, which is mine, and settle for $300. Now, you must take that or leave it, and I do not much care which it is.
Lawyer Daggett would not wish me to consider anything under $325. But I will settle for $320 if I am given the 20 in advance. Now, here's what I have to say about that saddle.
All right, very interesting. We see this young lady implementing many of the tools and techniques that we discuss in the class, where we talk about communication theory, motivation theory, understanding why the other party is at the table, and the building of leverage. We also see her maintain an effective relationship with the other party as well. So that's really what the focus of our efforts in negotiating for agreement are really focused on, is enhancing those skills and practicing them in a reasonable way in real life examples within the class itself. And that's what I have for you today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have at this time.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob, for presenting on this topic. It's actually really interesting to see that true grit seen in a new light after what you covered today. So we'll now move on towards the Q&A portion of the webinar. I think we have time for one question. So our question is it possible to touch on ways you can repair a relationship with someone after having a negative quick response to a challenge? Example, a conflict comes up, one party reacts negatively too quickly, and it creates for a challenging relationship in future projects.
Yes, this is a very common response that people will find in transactions. Is, as an example, I may get irate with someone, or I might find my emotions rising with regard to a given transaction. And often we find we simply have to apologize to the other party. We have to seek to repair the relationship before we continue the negotiation. And that can be very challenging for us. We see this often in disputes in neighborhoods or disputes between individuals in professional environments. And it is often very beneficial for us to focus just on the relationship as opposed to worrying about furthering our ends or furthering a transaction at that time.
Awesome, thank you so much. Sorry to anyone else if I can't get to your questions. We're cutting it pretty close with time. If you could just go to the last slide, please, Bob. Wonderful, thank you. So I mentioned earlier, we will send a link to the webinar recording within a week of today's webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar and want to dive deeper into this topic, please register for our upcoming webinar, Critical Thinking, Making Decisions That Stick. There's also a list of upcoming courses on the slide, as well as the college's contact information if you'd like to learn more information. And thank you again, Bob, so much for your time and incredibly useful information. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure meeting with all of the people on the call. I hope everyone has enjoyed it and found it a worthwhile use of their time.
Thank you. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.